In the sunburnt highlands of Prescott, Arizona, a haunted war veteran returns to silence the ghosts of his past. But when he finds a wild Mustang tied to a tree, left to die at the jaws of wolves, his battle begins again. Not for glory, not for revenge, but to break a brutal tradition and save a forgotten herd no one else dares to protect. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more. Prescott, Arizona had always been a land of dry breath and long shadows. The air was thin and restless, slipping through the pines with the whisper of old prayers. The land wore its age proudly. Cracked red earth, granite boulders weathered by generations of storms, and the scent of sagebrush that clung to the wind like a promise you couldn't forget. That day, the sky was a dusty blue, untouched by clouds, and the late afternoon sun poured molten gold across the granite dells, igniting the rocks in amber fire. It was the kind of weather that tricked the bones into remembering things they had tried to forget. Calder Rook stepped down from his old green pickup, its engine groaning to silence like an animal too tired to fight anymore. He stood tall, though time had bent him at the shoulders. His body was broad, not with vanity, but with the quiet strength of someone who had carried too much weight for too long. Scars webbed across his back beneath a flannel shirt too thin for the chill that rode the wind. His jeans were sun-faded, torn at the knee. A Marine once, now just a man out of place in his own story. Salted stubble covered his square jaw, and his dark hair, graying at the temples, was cropped short, military style, though longer than it once was. His steel blue eyes, heavy-lidded from lack of sleep, scanned the land with something between longing and dread. 22 years. That's how long it had been since he'd last set foot on this soil. The Rook family ranch, if you could still call it that, was a scattered skeleton of fence posts, rusted tools, and a house that leaned with the sorrow of being forgotten. He hadn't come back for nostalgia. Truth be told, he didn't know why he came back. Maybe the wind called his name. Or maybe, when there's nowhere left to go, a man always returns to the beginning. He passed beneath the tall ponderosa pines, their bark flaking like old parchment, their scent thick and resinous. A hawk cried somewhere above, unseen, and Calder's boots crunched over the brittle carpet of needles and dust. Each step stirred memories he didn't want: his father's voice, the smell of saddle oil, the thunder of hooves, and the laughter of a brother long dead. He didn't get far before the sound stopped him. It wasn't loud, just a sharp, breathless whinny that twisted the air like a cry half smothered in pain. Calder froze. Years of combat had trained his muscles to act faster than thought, and without hesitation he ducked into a crouch and followed the sound. The pines gave way to a small clearing sloped slightly downhill, the sun low now, casting long ribbons of light between the trees. That's when he saw it. A wild Mustang, black as night and trembling, was tied to a thick juniper tree by a frayed rope that cut deep into its neck. The stallion's coat was soaked in sweat, nostrils flared, eyes wide and rolling with terror. It pawed at the dirt, trying to pull back, but the rope wouldn't give. Its muscles rippled with panic. And worse, just beyond the golden edge of the clearing, 3 wolves circled, their eyes like amber coins in the dim light, their bodies tense with anticipation. Calder's jaw clenched. The largest wolf, a broad-shouldered gray with a jagged scar across its eye, took a step closer, low growl rumbling like distant thunder. The others flanked left and right, calculated, patient. They'd been waiting, watching. They knew the horse couldn't run. Calder's breath left his body like smoke. The rage came sudden and searing, not at the wolves, but at whoever had done this. Someone had tied this horse here, left it to die in fear. And Calder knew that feeling too well. Helplessness in the face of death. He had felt it in the deserts of Kandahar, when his squad was overrun, when bullets cracked like lightning and dust became blood. He had felt it tied to a chair, waiting for air that never came. He had come home, but home hadn't come with him. He moved quickly now. A blade was already in his hand, strapped to his hip from old habit. He didn't yell, he didn't run. He moved steady, like the wind before a storm. The wolves watched, ears twitching. The gray one growled louder, then hesitated. Something in Calder's walk, something in his eyes, stopped them. Perhaps they sensed the predator in him, the scarred beast beneath the skin. Calder pointed his blade. "Back off," he said, voice low, not asking. The gray wolf held his gaze. Then, with a grunt and a flick of the tail, it turned. One by one, the others followed, melting back into the trees. Only then did Calder let himself breathe. He stepped up to the horse. "Easy, boy," he whispered, voice hoarse. "I got you." The stallion flinched as he reached for the rope, muscles taut as wire, but it didn't rear. Calder noted that it wasn't trust, but it was the absence of fear. He saw something in those eyes. Not wildness, not even survival. Resentment. This horse had known freedom, and someone had taken it from him. With calm hands, Calder sawed through the rope. The fibers frayed, then snapped. The horse staggered back, gasping. For a moment, it just stood, legs trembling, ribs heaving. Then it bolted, hooves thundering into the forest, dark shapes swallowed by trees. Calder stood still. The silence returned, broken only by the wind and his heartbeat. His hands still shook, his chest still burned. He stared down at the rope. Someone had done this deliberately. This wasn't some sick prank. It was ritual. The forest had gone still again, the wind brushing against the pines like a hand smoothing over an old scar. Calder Rook remained in the clearing long after the Mustang disappeared into the shadows. His hands still clutched the remnants of the severed rope, coarse fibers stiff with sweat and something darker. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the start of something crueler, something that reached deeper than one horse, one act. He crouched beside the tree and examined the bark where the rope had cut in. The knot hadn't been amateur. Whoever tied this knew how to bind something strong. Calder recognized the technique, tight, low, and impossible to loosen with hooves or teeth. It was the same kind of tie used in military camps when securing equipment or prisoners. That detail turned something in his stomach. He stood slowly, muscles aching from disuse and tension. The Mustang's eyes wouldn't leave him. Not literally, but burned in his memory. Wild, wounded, human, in a way that made his chest feel hollow. Calder started walking, following the trail the horse had carved in the underbrush. The tracks were erratic, frantic, dotted with deep hoof impressions where the Mustang had faltered. He wasn't trying to recapture it. He just needed to know where it went. He needed to see that it was free. The trail ended near a dry creek bed lined with smooth stones. The sun was sinking fast now, casting bruised purple streaks over the distant hills. Calder spotted the horse again, a black silhouette against the fading sky. It stood still, head high, body taut with tension but unbroken. Calder didn't approach. He just watched. The wind shifted and the stallion turned slightly, nostrils flaring. Then it vanished, melting into the twilight as if it had never been there. Ashfall, Calder muttered, the name forming itself like smoke. It fit. The color of burnt ruin, the aftermath of something beautiful scorched. Ashfall. As he walked back toward the truck, the dark came fast. Coyotes howled farther west, but the wolves had moved on. Calder's boots scraped against dry pine needles. The land had quieted, but his thoughts hadn't. That knot, that rope, the way the wolves had waited. None of it sat right. The headlights of the truck cut through the trees as he approached, casting long shadows that danced on the trunks. As he opened the door, the radio crackled, a sound he hadn't expected. He hadn't touched it in months. Then a voice, smooth and unbothered, filtered through. Winds out of the northeast tonight, lows dipping into the 40s, clear skies over Yavapai County. Calder reached over and killed the radio. He didn't want the world to keep going. Not yet. He drove slowly down the narrow forest road, dust curling behind him like memory. About 10 miles out from town, a shape emerged in the distance. At first, he thought it was just another deer crossing. But as he got closer, he slowed to a stop. A dog. It stood in the middle of the road, lean and tall, its coat a mottled blend of tan and cream, with streaks of silver across the back. Ears perked, eyes alert. Not wild, but wary. Its body was thin, ribs pressing against fur that had lost its sheen. Calder rolled down his window. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly. The dog didn't move, just watched him. It was a blue heeler mix, probably 5 or 6 years old. Old enough to know people could be dangerous, young enough to still be cautious. There was a nick in one ear and a leather collar hanging loose around its neck, the tag long gone. Its posture was not aggressive, but it didn't trust him yet. Calder stepped out of the truck slowly. "You waiting for someone?" The dog sniffed the air but didn't back away. Instead, it lowered its head and gave a low, uncertain whine. Hunger, maybe? Or loneliness? Calder reached into the glove box and pulled out a protein bar, broke it in half, and crouched low. The dog crept forward slowly, legs stiff, one paw hesitant in front of the next. When it was close enough, it grabbed the food and darted back several steps before lying down and devouring it. Calder didn't try to touch it. "You can ride if you want," he said, standing. "It's a long walk to nowhere." He left the door open and walked back to the driver's seat. By the time he turned the engine over, the dog had already jumped into the bed of the truck, circling once before settling like it had always belonged there. Back at the ranch, Calder flicked on the barn lights. Weak yellow spilled into the darkness, catching dust motes in its beam. The barn was in better shape than the house, at least structurally. He grabbed an old feed bowl and filled it with water, then set it near the door. The dog climbed down carefully, sniffed the air, and lapped the water in long, slow pulls. "You can stay," Calder said, "but I'm not naming you yet." The dog looked up, and Calder swore it smirked. Inside the house, everything smelled of dry rot and old wood. He lit the fireplace and collapsed into the worn leather chair by the hearth. Flames crackled, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The wind outside picked up, brushing pine branches against the tin roof like skeletal fingers. His eyes drifted shut, but his mind wouldn't quiet. Ashfall. The rope. Wolves that didn't attack until dark. Someone had done this before. This wasn't random, it was a pattern. And someone needed to stop it. The fire had died down to glowing coals, and Calder Rook sat in the half-dark, staring at the empty hearth. The dog, now curled up near the door, snored softly, its sides rising and falling with each breath. Outside, the wind had calmed, but the night still held its bite. He should have slept. He hadn't. Something about the way that stallion had been tied up gnawed at his ribs. It wasn't just the method, it was the intent behind it. And Calder knew what it meant when something dangerous was done with belief behind it. He rose slowly, bones creaking, and walked to the kitchen. A dust-covered landline hung on the wall. He hadn't used it since returning. Next to it, a slim laminated card was pinned to a corkboard. Emergency contacts, left there by his father decades ago. Most of the numbers were useless now, but one stood out. The Prescott office of the Bureau of Land Management. His finger hovered over it for a long moment before dialing. It rang twice. "BLM, this is Maddox," a woman answered, her tone clipped and efficient. Calder hesitated. The voice had a subtle rasp, like sand brushed across steel. He pictured someone sharp-edged, hard to convince, harder to impress. "My name's Calder Rook. I live out near Skull Ridge off Forest Route 9. There was a pause on the line. "I know the area," she said. "You calling about land use or—" "No," Calder interrupted, jaw tight. "I found a wild horse tied up. Someone left it for predators. It wasn't an accident." The silence on the other end stretched, then sharpened. "How many?" she asked. "One tonight, but the way it was tied, I think it's been done before." Another pause, then a low breath. "All right, I'll be there in 45. The line went dead before Calder could respond. He hung up and glanced toward the dog, who lifted its head as if sensing something was about to change. "Guess we're having company," he muttered. The animal blinked slowly, then rested its head again. True to her word, 42 minutes later, the hum of an engine cut through the silence. Headlights flared across the gravel drive, and a government-issue SUV rolled to a stop outside the barn. Calder stepped out, arms crossed. The driver's door opened and Rain Maddox emerged. She was tall, 5'10" at least, with a lean, sinewy frame that moved like someone used to hiking remote trails. Her auburn hair was tied back in a messy braid, and her skin was sun-darkened, freckled, and wind-worn. She wore no makeup. Her green eyes were sharp, scanning everything with quick precision. Her uniform was standard issue, tan BLM field gear, dust-stained boots, a utility vest with clipped tools. She looked like someone who had spent more time under the sun than under a roof. Rain Maddox had worked for the Grand Canyon Wildlife Preservation Team before transferring to Prescott. A grisly encounter had left her with scars she didn't bother to hide, one running thin and pale along her jaw, a reminder of the day a rescue almost cost her her life. She wasn't the type to trust easily or waste time. "You called her?" she asked, stepping into the light. He nodded. Her gaze swept the surroundings, barn, trees, the faint scent of ash in the air. "Show me." They hiked the quarter-mile back into the forest where ashfall had been found. Calder didn't speak. Neither did she. The only sound was the whisper of pine needles beneath their boots. When they reached the tree, he handed her the rope. Rain crouched and ran her fingers along the frayed end. "This was done by someone who knows knots," she said. "Not a kid, not a random hiker." Calder nodded once. It was bait. Her eyes met his. No surprise in them, just confirmation. They turned to go, but before they reached the clearing's edge, Rain stopped. She scanned the ground, then moved quickly toward a second set of tracks, smaller, lighter. "Another horse," she murmured, crouching low. "Recent." She took off without waiting. Calder followed. They found the first one not far, tethered to a pine tree by a similar rope, this time a bay mare with white markings down her neck and haunch. She was smaller than Ashfall and in far worse shape. Her flanks were heaving. Blood crusted around her muzzle where the rope had cut in deep. Rain cursed under her breath and moved fast, pulling a compact blade from her boot. "Easy, girl," she whispered, slicing through the tensioned strands. The mare staggered back but didn't run. Her legs trembled, her head low. "She's been here longer than the other," Rain said, "maybe overnight." They moved again and found the second, a young colt no older than a year. It had collapsed beside a dry arroyo, barely breathing. Its coat, once probably a rich chestnut, was dulled with dust and matted sweat. Ribs stuck out sharp, and flies had begun to gather near its eyes. Rain knelt beside it, her voice a quiet mix of anger and care. "This one won't make it without help." Calder stood still, watching her work. He saw something in her he recognized, exhaustion disguised as efficiency. She didn't talk to fill space. She acted, with care, with practice, but with fury beneath it. "What do you want to do?" he asked. She looked up at him, eyes flaring. "I need a satellite call to HQ. This isn't an isolated incident. If someone's doing this systematically, we've got more than just animal cruelty here. We've got a belief system, a damn tradition." They worked in silence to carry the colt to her vehicle. Rain wrapped him in a tarp, placed a water dish by his head, and checked vitals with a small flashlight. She handed Calder a canteen. "Keep his lips wet." As she made the call, Calder sat by the colt's head, watching as the young horse blinked slowly, chest fluttering. Rain's voice, sharp and low, drifted from the trees. When she returned, she handed him a folded blanket. "Reinforcements will be here by dawn. I radioed in a vet unit from Flagstaff." She met his gaze squarely. "Whoever's doing this isn't just killing horses," she said. "They're trying to send a message." "Message to who?" Calder asked. Her answer was cold and certain. "To the wolves." The sun hadn't yet broken over the ridgeline when Calder Rook and Rain Maddox loaded into the BLM vehicle and rolled out along the east trail, tires crunching over frost-hardened dirt. The young colt had been taken by the emergency vet team an hour earlier, swaddled in blankets and oxygen, while the injured mare was stabilized and left resting under Rain's careful eye. Now, with their minds heavy and sleep sacrificed to adrenaline, they drove toward Wilcox Hollow, a quiet valley town cradled beneath the arms of the Prescott National Forest. Wilcox Hollow wasn't a place on most maps, just a spatter of weather-worn houses, 2 churches, and a single general store that doubled as a diner, a post office, and occasionally, a bar. Wooden fences marked invisible borders between ranches that had been passed down for generations. You didn't move to Wilcox Hollow, you were born into it. And outsiders? They were viewed with the suspicion reserved for tacksmen and wolves. Rain sat behind the wheel, one hand loose on the steering column, the other resting against her thigh. Her eyes were focused ahead, jaw tight, shoulders squared in a posture that said she wasn't expecting welcome. "You ever been out here?" she asked without looking. Calder shook his head. "My dad drove cattle through here in the 80s, said it was a place where the land didn't forget." She made a noise somewhere between agreement and irritation. "Land ain't the only thing that remembers," she muttered. As they pulled into the center of town, heads began to turn. Men leaned out of barns with narrowed eyes. Women paused in hanging laundry. A boy stopped mid-toss of a baseball to his younger brother. The sense of stillness was almost sacred. Not silence, just held breath. At the general store, an older man stepped out from beneath the porch awning. He wore a battered felt hat, a wool-lined denim jacket, and jeans that had been patched more times than replaced. His beard was short and gray, his skin wind-creased and browned from decades beneath the Arizona sun. He stood with the stillness of a man used to being listened to. Emmett Griggs, Rain said, stepping out and adjusting her BLM badge so it was visible. We're looking for you. Griggs didn't blink. I figured. Word travels. His voice was low and even, like the slow roll of storm clouds. He gestured toward a pair of rocking chairs beneath the overhang. If you want to talk, sit. You'll get more out of me that way. They obliged. Calder leaned back slightly, hands resting on his knees, while Rain remained upright, tense, alert. You already know what's happening, Rain said. Griggs nodded slowly. Ain't hard to guess. You found them, didn't you? Horses. 3 so far, Calder replied. 1 barely made it. Griggs exhaled through his nose. Damn shame. There was a long pause before Rain cut in. Why? That was the question. Not just the act, but the belief behind it. The part that didn't make sense unless you'd grown up close to the bone of this land. Emmett Griggs scratched the back of his neck, his eyes drifting out to the street where a pickup rumbled past, the driver not bothering to wave. You ever hear of the winter of '82? He asked. Calder nodded faintly. My father mentioned it, said it froze quicker than men could think. Griggs gave a short grunt of affirmation. That was the year the wolves came down, not just 1 or 2 strays, packs, desperate, lean. They started with the deer, moved on to the cattle. We lost 6 head in 2 nights. Some families lost their whole stock. It was bad. People started talking, old stories. What kind of stories? Rain asked, though her tone made it clear she already had an idea. The kind our grandfathers whispered, that if you give the wolves an offering, something easier than livestock, they'll take it and move on. An offering, she repeated bitterly. You mean a Mustang? Griggs didn't flinch. Wild ones weren't owned. No one fed them, no one branded them, so when the wolves took one instead of a steer, people saw it as a blessing. Rain stood, pacing now, her boots grinding against the wood. That's not a tradition, that's fear wrapped in ritual. Griggs didn't argue, he just looked at Calder. You understand it, don't you? Not saying it's right, but you know what it means to choose the lesser pain. Calder didn't answer right away. His mind wandered to the heat of a desert road, to the last look in a young soldier's eyes before the convoy got hit. He understood sacrifice, and how it could twist into something cruel when fear drove the steering wheel. I understand survival, he said finally, but this isn't that. This is belief with teeth. Rain returned to her chair, calmer now, but no less determined. How many still hold to this? She asked. Griggs exhaled. Not as many as you think, but enough. Especially the ones whose grandfathers told it like gospel. They believe it still works, that if they don't do it, they'll be next. Do you believe it? Calder asked. No, Griggs said quietly. But I ain't the only voice in town. Just then, a young woman stepped out of the store behind them. Late 20s, tall and broad-shouldered, with long black hair braided down her back. She wore a flannel shirt tucked into faded jeans, work gloves stuffed into her belt. Her name was June Griggs, Emmett's granddaughter. Unlike most of the town, she didn't carry suspicion in her eyes. Instead, there was a quiet intelligence, a strength earned from the land itself. She handed a can of coffee to her grandfather, then turned to Rain. If you're looking to change minds, June said softly, you'll need more than facts. You'll need proof, and you'll need someone they trust to say it. Calder met her gaze. She didn't look away. We'll take care of the horses, June continued. But if someone's doing this in secret, you'll have to find them before another one ends up tied to a tree. Rain gave a nod. We intend to. As they walked back to the SUV, the town's eyes followed them. Some curious, some cold, but a few, Calder noted, seemed uncertain now. Cracks in the foundation, the beginning of doubt. Back in the vehicle, Rain didn't start the engine right away. You believe him? She asked. Calder nodded slowly. Yeah, but this isn't just about tradition. Someone's keeping it alive, and they're not doing it alone. The sun had climbed just high enough to bleach the tops of the pine trees, painting the valley floor in long shadows as Calder Rook and Rain Maddox drove slowly along a rutted dirt road that split the northern ranchland. After the meeting with Emmett Griggs in Wilcox Hollow, their understanding of the situation had sharpened. This wasn't just ignorance or cruelty, it was belief, feral, inherited, and unexamined. But belief, Calder knew, was only dangerous when it bred silence. They were quiet during the drive, but it wasn't the strained quiet of disagreement. It was the quiet of people thinking the same thing at the same time. They had decided to split the day walking ranch to ranch under the guise of checking fencing and grazing permits, but both of them knew it was more than that. They were hunting for cracks, signs that someone in this valley was still practicing the old ways. The first 2 visits were fruitless. A wiry couple in their 60s with thick New Mexico accents insisted they hadn't seen any wild horses in months. A rancher with sunburned cheeks and nicotine-stained fingers gave a shrug and said, "Ain't my business what happens to the wild ones, long as the wolves stay off my land." But by the time they reached the 3rd property, the wind had shifted. It was a modest ranch tucked against a slope of granite boulders, the barn painted red but weather-faded to rust. The property looked active, tools were hung with care, the fencing mended recently. A wide pasture lay beyond the barn, empty at first glance. Calder scanned the open space, then pointed. "There," he murmured. A young man moved between the fence posts and the trees at the edge of the field, walking with purpose but not urgency. Slung over his shoulder was a thick coil of rope. He couldn't have been more than 16 or 17, tall and thin with long limbs still trying to catch up with his height. His dark blonde hair was tucked beneath a faded baseball cap, and his jeans were mud-stained from calf to thigh. "Let's not spook him," Rain said, voice low. They stepped out of the truck and walked slowly toward the tree line. The colt came into view first, a yearling Mustang, ash-gray with a black mane and wide, terrified eyes. Its sides quivered, and it stomped one hoof, sensing danger, but not understanding it. A loop of rope had already been tossed around its neck, but not yet secured. The boy was reaching for the second coil when he heard the sound of boots behind him and froze. "Hey," Calder called, not yelling, just enough to carry across the wind. The boy turned, startled. For a second, his body tensed like he might bolt. But Rain stepped into view, her badge visible, her voice calm. "Nobody's in trouble, we just want to talk." The boy hesitated, his mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted to the Mustang, then back to them. "What's your name?" Rain asked. "Micah," he said, barely above a whisper. "Micah what?" Calder added. "Micah Tomlin." Calder glanced at Rain. He remembered the name. Tomlin was an old family around here. Quiet, conservative, and loyal to the land. Micah stood stiffly, fingers tightening around the rope in his hands. Rain approached slowly, one step at a time, her hands low, unthreatening. "Micah, do you know why we're here?" The boy didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the rope like it might explain everything. "I wasn't gonna hurt it," he said suddenly. "Just do what I was told." "Who told you?" Rain asked gently. "My granddad," Micah said. "He said it keeps the wolves away." Calder stepped forward then, stopping a few feet from the boy. He looked at Micah, really looked. The awkward posture, the uncertainty behind the eyes, the hunger for approval behind every gesture. And suddenly, Calder saw himself. Not in uniform, not the battle-scarred man who came back from war, but the boy he'd once been, kneeling at his father's side, helping bind the legs of a calf that was too sick to stand. Not questioning, just learning, just obeying. He crouched slightly, arms on his knees. "Micah, how long have you been doing this?" The boy looked embarrassed. "First time alone. Granddad always did it, said someone's got to carry it on." Rain exchanged a glance with Calder, then walked toward the horse, careful not to make sudden moves. The colt twitched, but she murmured softly and started working the rope loose. "Micah," Calder said, "do you believe it works?" There was a long pause. The boy shrugged. "I don't know, but what if it does? What if not doing it makes everything worse?" Calder nodded slowly. "I used to think that way too. When I was in the Marines, they told us to follow orders, no questions. Sometimes that saved lives. Other times it didn't. I stopped asking what would happen if I didn't obey. Started asking if what I was doing was right." Micah looked down at his hands. "You're not a bad kid," Calder added. "But doing something just because someone told you to isn't the same as believing in it." The boy's shoulders slumped. Rain had freed the horse. The colt jerked back, then bolted into the trees, hooves scattering dirt and leaves. Micah didn't chase. He just stood there, blinking fast like he wasn't sure whether to be ashamed or relieved. Rain stepped beside him. "Do you want to help instead of harm?" she asked. Micah nodded, slowly but firmly. "Then start here," she said, handing him the coiled rope. "Start by not doing what you were taught, and figuring out what you believe for yourself. He took it in both hands. As they walked back to the truck, Calder felt the weight of something shift. A small win. A dent in a legacy passed down too long without question. Rain seemed to feel it too. She didn't smile, but her jaw loosened, her shoulders a little less rigid. "You were good with him," she said. Calder didn't answer right away. "He reminded me of someone." "Yourself?" she asked. "No," he said softly. "Someone I failed to protect." The wind stirred again, curling the dust up from the road, whispering around them like it had its own opinion. Somewhere behind them, Micah stood still, watching the trees. By dusk, the edge of Wilcox Hollow had transformed into something that looked more like a battleground than a ranch. The pasture perimeter was lined with new fencing, thick-gauge wire strung between steel posts, with solar-powered electric strands humming just above the ground and near the top rail. Flashing LED deterrent lights were fixed at intervals, programmed to blink at irregular patterns designed to confuse nocturnal predators. Hidden speakers lay embedded behind hay bales and fence posts, ready to emit high-frequency sounds imperceptible to human ears, but sharp enough to startle wolves. It had taken them all day, with help from a few reluctant locals, mostly younger folks like June Griggs and Micah Tomlin. Both had returned quietly that morning to offer their help without needing to be asked. June, Emmett Griggs' granddaughter, worked beside Rain without a word wasted. At 29, she moved with practiced confidence, her long braids swinging behind her like a banner. Her hands were calloused, her boots dusty, and her flannel sleeves rolled up to reveal a small tattoo of a Mustang running across her forearm, something Calder hadn't noticed before. She had inherited the land's hard spirit, but not its fear. When she spoke, it was in low tones, practical and unshaken. Micah, wearing a clean shirt but still carrying the guilt of the day before in his eyes, had driven posts into the ground with quiet diligence. He didn't look for approval. He just worked like he needed to. The old guard didn't offer much. Emmett watched from his porch, pipe in hand, gaze unreadable. Other ranchers stood along the fence line farther out, some with arms crossed, some with hands shoved into denim pockets, their expressions mixtures of skepticism and buried hope. Calder Rook moved from station to station, double-checking every wire and light. The dog, now unofficially called Dusty, followed a few paces behind him. Dusty had claimed the barn as home since that first night, but tonight the blue heeler mutt was tense, ears perked, tail stiff, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. As twilight fell, Calder and Rain stood side by side near the largest paddock, where a dozen Mustangs recently rescued and corralled, grazed in relative peace. These weren't owned horses, not officially. They were the wild ones, recovered, treated, and now watched over by volunteers until relocation could be arranged. "They'll come," Rain said simply. Calder nodded. "It's the first calm night in a week. If they're hungry, they'll test the perimeter." The wind picked up and the temperature dropped. Coyotes yipped in the distance, but the forest beyond the ridge held a heavier silence. By 10, the town had begun to gather near the barn, dozens of figures wrapped in flannel and denim, flashlights in hand, whispering among themselves but too nervous to stay home. Someone had brought coffee, someone else a thermos of broth. No one said why they were there, but Calder knew. These were people whose hands had once tied rope around horses' necks because their fathers had, because someone told them it was protection. Now they came to see something new. Just after midnight, the first howl echoed from the pines. Long and low, a sound that threaded through bone. Dusty stiffened, growled once, then lowered his belly to the dirt. The crowd fell silent. Another howl answered, closer. Then another. 6 wolves, maybe more. Calder felt his chest tighten. He glanced toward Rain, who stood firm, her fingers curled loosely at her side. A flash of movement near the far fence, gray fur darting between shrubs. The blinking deterrent lights activated immediately. The closest wolf paused, startled. It crept forward again, eyes gleaming amber in the light. Then the frequency kicked in. It was faint, even for Calder. Just a distant, high-pitched whine, but the wolf jerked its head, flinched, and backed off with a snarl. 2 more emerged from the ridge. One tried a different approach, lower down, near the barn's southern corner. This time, Dusty sprang into action, barking with surprising ferocity, chasing the perimeter just behind the fence line. The wolves froze. Another deterrent lit up, Closer this time, a red-blue strobe. Then came the low boom of the subsonic pulse from the speaker nearest the barn, a thud like a heartbeat beneath the earth. That was enough. One by one, the wolves turned. Some lopped away. Others lingered for a few seconds longer, their instincts battling hunger. But eventually, the trees swallowed them whole, and the night fell still again. The Mustangs inside the paddock remained calm, not a single one injured. Rain exhaled slowly, her breath fogged in the cold air. Calder turned toward the crowd. Faces shifted in the dark, many of them unreadable, but a few softened. Micah had stood the whole time near the gate. When Calder met his eyes, the boy nodded once. Even Emmett, pipe tucked between his lips, gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "It worked," someone murmured from the back. A woman's voice followed. They didn't even get close. Rain walked up to the barn and leaned against a post. "You all saw it. You saw what's possible." No one responded right away. But no one left either. "Belief is powerful," Calder said, stepping beside her, "but it should never be more powerful than truth." June crossed her arms, watching her neighbors. "Then let's start telling a different story." They stood there for a while, waiting, watching. But the wolves did not return, and for the first time in a long time, Wilcox Hollow slept without sacrifice. The morning after the wolves were driven back, Wilcox Hollow woke into a strange stillness. Not the silence of dread, but the pause that follows when an old story has been challenged and no one knows what ending to believe anymore. Calder Rook stood outside the barn, arms folded over his chest, watching the sky lighten with soft bands of rose and ash. Dusty trotted past him, ears alert, tail low and twitching. In the pasture, the Mustangs grazed calmly. Not one of them bore a new wound. The line of electric fencing glowed faintly in the dawn, its work done for now. Behind him, Rain Maddox emerged from the tack room, mug of instant coffee in one hand and her tablet in the other. Her eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep, but her posture was as steady as ever. She leaned against a post, swiped open a file, and began scrolling. "They're calling a town meeting tonight," she said without looking up. "Griggs sent word. Wants everyone to hear what happened last night. Face to face." Calder nodded. "He's got pull?" "He's got roots," Rain replied. "People won't admit it, but they trust him more than most. If he's the one asking questions, others will follow." Still, not everyone was ready to listen. That much was made clear when Kellen Royce rolled into town. The Royce Ranch was the largest property for miles, a sprawling empire of grazing land and water rights passed down for 4 generations. Kellen had inherited it young after a freak hay baler accident took his father's leg and the man's will to run the land. At 38, Kellen was a broad-shouldered, clean-cut figure who carried himself like he expected the world to move out of his way. His short brown hair was always neatly combed beneath a crisp ranch hat. His shirts ironed even in mud season, and his voice bore the confidence of someone who believed conviction was always louder than evidence. He arrived unannounced, stepping down from a spotless black pickup that bore no trace of dust. 2 ranch hands flanked him, young men wiry and nervous, but loyal. Calder watched from a distance as Rain greeted him with a nod. "Kellen," she said flatly, "didn't think we'd see you." "I heard about the wolves," he said, scanning the paddock. "Heard you lit up half the forest like a disco bar. Impressive show." She didn't flinch. Not a show, a solution. Royce shrugged. "Wolves didn't take anything this time, but that doesn't mean your lights and sirens will work next week, or the week after that." Calder stepped in, voice quiet but pointed. "Better odds than tying up Mustangs and hoping teeth choose wisely." Royce's eyes narrowed. "And what would you know about it, Rook? You've been gone 20 years. You didn't lose cattle. You didn't watch your livelihood bleed out in the snow." "No," Calder replied. "But I've watched men bleed out because they believed following orders was safer than questioning them. That's what this is, isn't it? Not protection. Submission to fear." The words cut deeper than Royce let on. He turned toward the fence, watching the horses move through the morning mist. "You think this changes everything?" he asked. "One night without blood?" "It's a start," Rain said. Royce shook his head. "It's weakness. Wolves adapt. They'll learn to ignore the lights. Your sound tricks won't hold them back forever." "Maybe not," Rain answered. "But until they do, no horses die. And maybe, just maybe, people around here start using their heads instead of leaning on ghosts." That earned a scowl. "You'll never understand what it's like to have everything riding on a herd," Royce growled. "My grandfather taught me to protect our land the way he protected his. You think you can erase that in a weekend?" "No," Calder said. "But I can sure as hell try." That evening, the town gathered in the schoolhouse, a squat, timber-framed building that had once been a one-room classroom and now served as a catch-all for weddings, funerals, and heated debate. Rows of folding chairs filled the open hall, and beneath the glow of hanging lamps, Wilcox Hollow came to face itself. June Griggs stood near the door, clipboard in hand, checking names as people arrived. She wore a thick wool cardigan, sleeves pushed up, hair pulled into a knot. She wasn't smiling, but her presence was solid, like stone worn by river water. Micah sat near the back, his hat in his lap, fidgeting with the brim. His grandfather hadn't come, too proud, or too afraid. Calder stood to one side with Dusty curled at his feet, tail thumping softly against the floor. Rain stood center, a projection screen behind her and her tablet casting a soft glow. She didn't waste time. "We've recorded no predation in the past 72 hours, she began. 6 wolves entered the area last night. All were repelled without loss of livestock or injury to any horse. Some murmurs, a scoff from one corner. She tapped her tablet. On the screen, a grainy infrared video showed the wolves approaching, startled, then fleeing. Another tap showed a graph. Livestock losses per month over the last year. A drop-off at the start of this week. "None of this is theory anymore," she said. "It's fact." Someone stood up, middle-aged, rail-thin with a sloped nose and thick mustache. Wallace Price, a fence builder known for his bitter mouth. "So what?" he barked. "Next winter comes, the wolves adapt, and we're back where we started. You're gambling with people's livelihoods." "No," Rain said. "I'm giving you tools to protect them. Tools that don't require sacrifice." Another voice, this one quiet. A woman named Helen Morales, widow, 72, who ran a feed store. "My father used to tie up strays," she said. "Said it saved the herd, but I always wondered if it really did. Now I'm not so sure." Royce stood near the front. "And when it doesn't work," he challenged, "when the wolves get smarter?" "We adjust," Calder said. "That's what people do. We learn. We change. What we don't do is keep killing innocent creatures because it's easier than trying something new." Silence. Then June stepped forward. "My generation isn't afraid of trying," she said. "We've seen what standing still does. It keeps us chained to pain. It's time we unlearn." Bit by bit, hands went up. Questions came. Doubt was aired like stale sheets on a line. And for the first time, not everyone defended the past. When the meeting ended, Rain and Calder stepped into the cold night, their breath steaming. "You think it's stuck?" she asked. Calder looked up at the stars. "It's stuck enough to crack the shell. That's how change begins." The horizon over Prescott cracked open with the slow gold of dawn, spilling light across the valley like a blessing. The frost had lifted from the grass, and a gentle wind stirred the branches of the tall ponderosa pines surrounding the Rook family ranch. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled faintly of pine smoke and earth, clean in a way that made Calder Rook breathe deeper than he had in years. He stood beside the front fence line, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders square, as he looked out over the pasture. The house behind him, once abandoned and leaning into rot, had started to breathe again. Rain Maddox had replaced the hinges on the barn doors last week. Micah had offered to fix the sagging porch, and June Griggs had shown up yesterday afternoon with a bundle of fence planks and a determined look, saying simply, "I figured you'd be staying." Calder hadn't answered then, not aloud. But the answer was written in his boots, which hadn't left the soil in days. Now, in the quiet light, the Mustangs grazed contentedly on the far side of the fence. Ashfall wasn't among them. Not yet. Rain stepped up beside Calder, her breath visible in the chill. She wore her usual BLM field jacket, but her hair was loose for once, auburn strands catching the morning light like copper thread. Her face was calm, unreadable as always, but there was a softness there now, a shift in the lines around her eyes, in the way her shoulders no longer braced for battle. "You still thinking about leaving?" she asked. Calder shook his head slowly. "I was never really thinking about it, just didn't know I had a reason to stay." Rain didn't smile, but she tilted her head slightly, the closest she came to approval. "And now?" He nodded toward the pasture. "Now I've got one." They stood in silence for a few minutes, watching as a few ranchers rolled past in pickups, giving slow, uncertain waves. Yesterday, they might have passed without so much as a glance. But something had changed since the town meeting. It wasn't just the data or the videos. It was the moment when words ran out and people looked each other in the eye and saw fear replaced by responsibility. Small changes had begun. Wooden gates had been replaced by self-latching, predator-resistant fencing. Ranchers who once refused BLM guidance were asking for schematics. One even asked Rain where he could buy those flashing deterrent lights. No one admitted they were wrong. But then, real change rarely came with an apology. It came with action. Calder heard a rustle on the ridge above and turned his gaze upward. There, on the rocky outcrop of Granite Ridge, a dark shape stood silhouetted against the light. Ashful. The black Mustang was as proud and untamed as ever, his coat gleaming in the dawn like obsidian glass. He stood with his head high, ears forward, watching the valley below as if he were a sentinel born to guard it. His mane blew lightly in the breeze, wild and unbroken. Rain followed Calder's gaze and breathed in softly. "He's been coming back every morning," she said. "Never closer than that, just watching." "He's got his own way," Calder murmured. "Some things aren't meant to be caught." As if hearing him, Ashfall snorted, pawed the edge of the ridge once, then turned and disappeared back into the trees. Calder felt something shift in his chest. Not sadness, not longing, but something lighter. It wasn't closure, it was continuation. "I think I want to rebuild the stables," he said. "Turn them into something more permanent. Maybe a sanctuary. For the ones like him. The ones who never had a place." Rain's gaze lingered on him. "You're serious?" "Yeah. Maybe with help. Maybe with more people like June. Like Micah. Ones who've seen what can change." She crossed her arms. "I'd stay on a while. Help you set it up." He turned to her. "I was hoping you'd say that." In the days that followed, change came steadily. It wasn't sweeping or dramatic. It was humble, measured in boards hammered, in new pasture maps drawn, in cold coffee shared on early mornings between neighbors who once only nodded across fences. Micah arrived daily, carrying a notepad filled with sketches of trap-free corrals and grazing rotation plans he'd researched online. His energy was still nervous, but now it came from eagerness, not shame. June began organizing weekend workshops at the schoolhouse, using BLM materials and inviting guest speakers from other states. She handled skeptics with a dry wit and an iron will, earning grudging respect from even the most stubborn ranchers. Even Emmett Griggs dropped by the ranch one afternoon, walking with a slow limp and leaning on a cane no one had seen before. He didn't say much, just watched the horses for a long moment, then offered a nod that said more than a speech ever could. One morning, Calder found a hand-painted sign leaning against the barn door. "Granite Hollow Refuge, wild and free." He didn't know who made it, but he left it where it was. That evening, as the sun dipped low again, Calder sat on the back porch, watching the light fade. Dusty lay curled at his feet, ears flicking at the sounds of birds settling in. Rain stepped out, a folder in hand. "Permits came through," she said. "We're official." Calder looked out at the land, the hills, the fences, the trees, and the Mustangs. "Good," he said. "Then we begin." And with that, the wind picked up, cool and clean, and carried the promise of something new. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or lightning. Sometimes they come in the shape of a black Mustang standing at the edge of a ridge, free, wild, and unbroken. They come when one man lays down his wandering and chooses to stay. When fear is replaced by understanding, when tradition bows to compassion. This story reminds us that even the most hardened hearts can soften, that the past does not have to define the future, and that God's grace often shows up not in grand gestures, but in small changes, quiet choices, and in the courage to protect what cannot speak for itself. So if this story touched your spirit, take a moment to reflect on what you've been called to protect, in your life, in your family, in your heart. And if you believe God still works through people, through animals, through the land itself, say amen in the comments to declare it. Share this story if it moved you. Subscribe to our channel to walk with us on more journeys like this, and may the Lord bless you with clarity, courage, and compassion wherever you stand today.